Welcome to the third, we'll call them semi-annual Robert Barclay Institute Symposium. The Robert Barclay Institute is an organization created to encourage and broaden Quaker scholarship among Evangelical Friends. And the Symposium is the Institute's vehicle for giving such research a voice, with the intent of inspiring informed and passionate discussion on topics concerning both Quakerism as an historical movement and as a present vital expression of the Christian faith. Our aim is to expand the conversations here into other work that would ultimately result in the conversion of lives, communities, and the world. The topic tonight is the Friends' testimony of peace. In 1650, George Fox was committed to the prison in Derby as a blasphemer. And during his time there, he debates with visiting professors of the faith, his jailkeeper is convinced, and many other things happen, not the least of which is that George Fox establishes himself as a man of such virtue among the soldiery that they offer to release him if he would accept the position of captain in the army. He refuses, and he was jailed for an even longer period of time, but the statement of his refusal, as recorded in his journal, has become a cornerstone of the society. Fox says, "I told them I knew whence all wars arose, even from the lusts, according to James' doctrine, and that I lived in the virtue of that life and power that took away the occasion of all wars." From the very inception of our movement, the idea of living out of an inner peace given by the grace of God has been deeply woven into the fabric of our identity. As a friend of both of the men that are going to share tonight, I can assure you that that peace is exemplified in their lives and in their work. If you aren't familiar with the procedures of a symposium, the emphasis is on the exchange of ideas. So symposium it's a Greek word that literally means to drink together. So a work is brought before us that we all imbibe and interact with. A response will be given, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So as you're listening, be thinking of things that you want to ask or points that interest you to talk about later. Our presenter is Nate Perrin. He'll be reading his paper titled The Gospel of Kashkawa, A Call to Peace. Nate is currently pursuing his MA here at Barclay College with a concentration in Quaker Studies. He's also the pastor of Valton Friends Meeting in Wisconsin and a team director for the Boys and Girls Club of America. Please welcome me in joining Nate. Join me in welcoming Nate.
During the September 2017 delegation of Christian peacemaker teams to Iraqi Kurdistan, one of the villages that was met and reported on was a small indigenous Christian village named Kashkawa. The village faith belonged to an offshoot of Orthodoxy called Armenian Orthodoxy. This is a branch of Christendom that is in communion with the Oriental Orthodox Church. They are not, however, in communion with the Eastern Orthodox Church due to a different understanding of the nature of Christ. During the Saddam Hussein regime, there was a genocide enacted called the Anfal Campaign. It was mainly aimed at the Kurdish population in Iraq. What had happened was that the Kurds were treated as terrorists, and they were thus used for experimentations in prisons, as well as being chemically bombed by the Iraqi government. This tiny village suffered the consequences of that, since it was located 5 miles away from another Kurdish village called Dupre. Their village was torn down 7 times, and every single time it was rebuilt. The team report, as well as other eyewitness accounts, detail a church in this cross's courtyard, or the church's courtyard. The cross had bullet holes in it. What had happened during this regime was that the soldiers took this cross and used it for target practice. In response, as a token of faith, the Christians took this cross and left it erected in the courtyard as a promise to themselves that God has overcome the world, and that while the world was going to respond to them with violence and oppression, they were going to respond with the love of Christ. This peace testimony extends even beyond this account. Recently, both the Kurdish Muslim village of Dupre and Kashkawa have been the victims of illegal bombings by the Turkish government. And instead of dividing further from each other, they decided to do the opposite. The communities bonded together through the shared struggle, reflecting a narrative that is often ignored in the Western media. The bombings became so frequent that they have keys to one another's houses. Both communities absolutely trust each other, and they have stuck together in the face of oppression and violence. During the Christmas season of 2017, Chaldean Catholics, another sect in Iraqi Kurdistan, held their Christmas Eve Mass services for the first time since ISIS came down. The audience that was attended was surprising, yet was consistent with the peace testimony found in Kashkawa. Muslim clerics, as well as other religious leaders, were attending this Christmas Mass and hearing the gospel preached. A question is then to be asked: is this peace testimony common among the Christians in Iraq and in the Middle East, and what has led to this phenomenon? The Christian population that this presentation will particularly focus on is going to be found in Iraqi Kurdistan. The majority of my own research and experiences have centered on this point. Most of the Christian population found in Kurdistan are Christians who fled persecution after the Armenian genocide in Turkey during 1915. One little known agenda that this genocide also had was an intentional mission to exterminate Assyrian Christianity. One disturbing telegram that has been found describes a general who discovered a village and decided to target the Christian population specifically. The Valley of Diakbar, Rachid Bey, is like an unleashed wild animal in his treatments of the Christians in his valley. Recently, he summoned the gendarmes of Diakbar to Mardin, who on his orders rounded up 700 Christians, mostly Armenian, including the Armenian bishop, and slit their throats like sheep in and around the town. Early reports also attest to witnessing the Kurdish villages having no sympathy on the Christian refugees as well. There are reports of rape, starvation, famine, and entire villages being pillaged because of their Christian identity. In an attempt to fight back, the Assyrian Christians organized the army to rise against the Turkish military, but it came to no avail and the losses were numerous. Assyrian Christianity continued to be part of the oppressive DNA of the culture around Iraq, Kurdistan, Syria, and Turkey. And perhaps the most devastating blow to the Assyrian and Chaldean Christians in this region was the 2004 invasion of Iraq. The Iraqi population watched the American government, which is perceived by the world to be a representation of Christianity, bomb them during the shock and awe campaign and occupy their country for 8 years. Famous evangelical leaders had stood behind the pulpit and television and declared that God was especially blessing the invasion. This then led to a harsh backlash against the Christian population there. Churches and historic architecture were destroyed. The Iraqi population associated Western Christianity to their own neighbors, and they were thus seen as being part of the problem of why the Americans had invaded. And according to Maxine Nash, a former Christian Peacemaker Team's member, Christians had one of two options. They could either pick up a gun or they could flee. The vast majority chose to flee because of the threat of Al-Qaeda. What makes things more complex for the Christians there was the abrupt exiting of the American military. The Kurds, for instance, would say taking out Saddam Hussein was a good thing. But what was even worse was the way American military left. One interview from the September 2017 delegation mentioned earlier stated that before the U.S. invasion, there was only one dictator. Now there are 100. And while this may be an exaggeration, it is a statement that reflects the common attitudes of the citizens there. During the rise of ISIS in 2014, Christians were forced to flee into the Kurdish region of Iraq once again. And despite the harshness they have faced in surrounding countries, the Kurdish region of Iraq is arguably more Christian-friendly than Israel. However, that did not remove the tensions found religiously and culturally at first. A rare turning point started to happen for these churches. They were suddenly in a situation where they had to get to know their neighbors, the very people they may have been afraid to approach. Now, in war, Christians drifted into two extremes. Either they became radically pacifist, or they took up arms to defend themselves. In Syria, the Assyrian Christian militias that were originally supposed to protect the Christian villages ended up joining either side of the civil war that is currently happening. Violence is social capital in the Middle East. And another complex problem that was presented was this realization, that ISIS was never going to go away through force. As long as the ideology of ISIS was still prevalent, the threat would never truly go away. Thus, the question then becomes, how does one fight ideology? The Orthodox and Chaldean churches in this area decided that, in order for Christianity to continue to thrive and for overall peace to reign, they needed to focus on community development and peacemaking. This peacemaking view has become the heartbeat of their theology. They are not only starting to see it as a requirement of the church, but they see it as a form of outreach that is scripturally mandated. Other religious leaders have started participating in this as well, with an intentional campaign in a lot of mosques to talk about the way of peace. In a statement delivered to the International Ecumenical Peace Convocation, Orthodox leaders stated, "The Church understands peace and peacemaking as an indispensable aspect of its life and mission to the world. It guards its faith conviction upon the wholeness of the biblical tradition as it is properly interpreted through the Church's liturgical experience and practice. The Eucharist provides a space in which one discerns and experiences the fullness of Christian faith in the history of God's revelation. It reflects the image of God's Trinitarian life in human beings and relates in love with the totality of the created world." Later on in the document, it states that the absolute need and mandate of Christian churches to participate in community development. Peace begins with ourselves, our families, and our neighbors. From an Orthodox point of view, the Trinitarian model of relationship and Eucharistic practice, small L liturgy after the big L liturgy, leave no space for the aggressiveness, violent behavior, or injustice. They leave no space for a passive attitude, but only for a dynamic dialogue and action for the change and transformation of oneself and the world. However, there are critical questions of theology and anthropology that need further and more profound analysis. On the basis of tradition and patristic heritage, Orthodox must grow in our self-understanding, especially in relation to the challenges raised by domestic violence and the ongoing quest for peace in the community. In order to move forward, these indigenous Christian communities had a challenge. They needed to forgive their enemies and get to know the other communities that in the past may have been hostile to the Christian faith. According to Kurdish peace activist Rajir Fakir, the issue was not mainly religious differences to begin with. It was that politics got into relationship with religion. For thousands of years, the religions in at least the Kurdish region of the Middle East got along with one another. It was when oppressors and politics got involved that these communities started to turn against each other. And after 2014, priests and bishops were encouraged to meet with Islamic clergy and other representations of religion around the region to discuss ways to foster a peaceful relationship with one another. Islamic clerics are now constantly preaching peace in their mosques. What made the solidarity of the Christmas Eve Mass so significant was that it was the first time these services were held publicly since ISIS. As a sign that the other community members were supportive of these churches, they all came together in a Christmas Eve Mass and heard the gospel preached. For Eastern Christianity, social justice and peacemaking are not topics to be debated, but rather to be accepted without hesitation. For them, it is a matter of survival and being consistent with the Christ that is presented in scriptures. And perhaps a sign that American evangelical Christianity is privileged in itself is the fact that there are now public debates currently hosted to discuss whether or not peacemaking and community development are biblical concepts. This is not to say that there is not any participation in military programs for the Christians around this region, but overall the leaders of the Orthodox and Catholic churches in the area are pushing for community building and peace. Quakerism is a theology and faith that seeks to become a form of primitive Christianity. When these indigenous Christian communities are examined, there are a lot of commonalities to be found. The biggest shared intersection of beliefs so far is this belief of the peace testimonies. Peace churches have a rare window of opportunity to host and send peace missions to the Middle East. These missions should not to be proselytized in nature, but rather to accompany the already existing Christian communities, maintain their peace testimonies, and to further their community development. American churches have a responsibility to the Middle East, especially after the damage the invasion has had on the country as a whole. With the rise of the current political climate and the refugee crisis, the American church has a unique opportunity on its hands. Friends theology, with its history of peacemaking and social justice, endorses an idea of direct nonviolent action. What better place to practice these peace testimonies than in the very areas the American government has damaged? The American media has a different narrative of what is occurring in this region of the world. It is not being reported on what's happening in this part of the country beyond Palestinian-Israeli crisis. In September 2017, a referendum was passed to establish the Kurdish region of Iraq as its own unique state and territory. The Kurdish government was depending upon American support for this. The evangelist Franklin Graham openly declared that Kurdistan deserved its own independence, as did most members of Congress. Kurdistan is one of those rare countries that has 10 religious groups coexisting alongside each other, and they have the potential for a democracy. And it is an example that the rest of the region can look to. However, they were denied their right to exist as a country. The American government helped to prevent this nation state from existing, and the American media barely touched on this. As a result of the American government turning its back on its Kurdish allies that it had during the Iraq War, the Turkish, Iraqi, and Iranian governments all started opening fire on Kurdish villages and bombing them. Protests were soon held after that, resulting in 100 or so deaths in themselves. Turkey recently declared war on a Kurdish village in Syria named Afrin. The supposed terrorist group they have declared war on was funded and backed by the US military. The only real impact and sign that this is occurring in the world is live footage of the bombings and the violence being posted on social media. The United Nations has recently announced a ceasefire in that village, but whether or not the people will listen is a mystery. The indigenous Christian communities present a more forward way of thinking, that peacemaking and community development are part of what it means to be a Christian. History has proved time and time again that American military intervention in the Middle East has led to the oppression of these communities. As mentioned earlier, the reason for this is because during the Bush era especially, evangelical leaders used God to justify invading Iraq. There were several famous pastors preaching from the pulpit that God had specifically ordained the war. And when the Arab world looks at Christians preaching from the pulpit that God approves of their suffering, naturally the response to the Christians in their own communities will be hostile. The East views the West as a representation of Christianity. In reality, it is not, of course, Christianity that is causing these problems, but rather hasty decisions about complex conflicts. One example of this is how the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is viewed. The Western narrative is, of course, that it is the Jews against everyone else, and they are completely innocent. What many Westerners do not realize is that 80% of Israelis are completely secular. It is the Palestinians that have the strongest religious connections in that region. A peace activist from Australia named Peter Morgan worked with an organization called the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program for Palestine and Israel and witnessed a lot of this persecution firsthand. The organization was started because Palestinian Christians went to the World Council of Churches and asked for support because of the oppression they were enduring both culturally and from the government. Michelle Friesen, a Canadian peace activist who worked with Mennonite Central Committee in Palestine and Israel and is now working with Christian peacemaker teams as the Canadian coordinator, wrote that every Friday morning, Israelis and Palestinians get together and have a peaceful, nonviolent protest of what's happening. That rarely catches the Western media's attention, however. This is not being stated as a way to support either side, but rather to paint a portrait of how complex the issues in the Middle East actually are, and how the American government complicates things further when the issues are viewed through the lens of simplistic religion and politics. No matter what stand one takes on the issue of Israeli-Palestine, there should be a concern about the high number of human rights abuses that are being recorded. However, once again, only 40% or so of American Jews support Israel as a religious state, and many Israelis want to come to a peaceful agreement about the Palestinians. The overwhelming narrative seems to be that a secular state is likely to happen a few decades down the road. All of this is to say is that these countries and these communities can come to their own solutions without the assistance of the American government's interference, but there are ways that NGOs and churches can assist these peace processes. Peace churches have a window that is being opened up to them to come in alongside these communities and participate in preserving the most ancient cultures in the world. This is also an opportunity to help attempt to reverse that damage that was done by disastrous foreign policy. The type of peace that Kashkawa displays is a peace that is attainable, albeit it will take hard work. The process to that level of peaceful existence will be hard, but it can be done. Once religion can be removed from the sphere of politics, then results can start to happen. This type of peacemaking has not only worked in Kurdistan, but has worked in the United States. A pastor named Reverend Jeffrey Brown participated in what is now known as the Boston Miracle. In the course of 4 years, Boston saw a 79% reduction in violence. What helped this process were the clergy who would walk the streets late at night talking with gang members and working with the police to make the communities a safer place. And because of these efforts of a young pastor with a radical vision, the entire city changed. Dr. Peter Block, in his book Community, documents the best way to resolve violence is not through government action, but rather in neighborhoods getting to know one another and building relationships. Kashkawa and Boston prove this point. Quakers are well renowned, historically speaking, for being the only religious group in American history to treat the Native Americans with respect and dignity. The Quakers did evangelize to the Native Americans, but they did it in such a way that they respected the Native American identity. This testimony continues to echo into a Native American culture well into the 21st century. The Native Americans were seen as savages that needed to be civilized, but the Friends Church helped to break that narrative. And somehow the Friends Church has lost that sense of radical need to break cultural barriers to help the other person. For instance, the only Friends presence in the Middle East is through Ramallah Friends Meeting and their school, as well as the Alternative to Violence program. Other churches that are in that region, though, Presbyterian Church USA, with their group Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, there are 5 churches there, and the Seventh-day Adventists, who are also another peace church. I believe fully that the Friends Church would be received with open arms in Iraqi Kurdistan if they came to assist the Christian communities there, as well as other religious communities who would seek help in amplifying their voices. Friends theology embraces the universal church. And although the sacraments and their overall theology is something the Friends may not find agreement with, it is absolutely necessary and vital to maintain those communities because of their cultural heritage. It is a rare glimpse into the past. The Friends, of course, cannot change the sacramental nature or the Oriental Orthodox or Chaldean Catholic theologies, because that would be combating over 2,000 years of tradition, and also that would not be respecting the identities found in Christianity that has sustained these communities through various genocides and oppression. However, the Oriental Orthodox Church has officially joined the World Council of Churches, so they are open to the idea of working with other Christian churches and communities. It is simply up to the Western churches to respond in kind. The gospel is plain and simple in its command. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor. What these communities are doing is a fulfillment of both of these commands. The Friends Church being willing to step up and participate in this radical way of sharing Christ to the world is an idea that is not only Christ-like in its essence, but also entirely doable and possible. In conclusion, the words of George Fox ring true. Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage in life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone, whereby in them you may be a blessing and make the witness of God in them to bless you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nate. Our responder, Jesse Waller. Jesse is a Master of Arts in Quaker Studies. His thesis was Quakers in Prison Ministry, a comprehensive study of prison reform. Jesse is currently serving as chaplain at the Topeka Correctional Facility. Most importantly, he's a proud new dad. Please join me in welcoming Jesse.
Sorry.
That's more for the people online.
Hello. All right. So I'm going to offer my response. And I'm sorry if my pronunciation is not exactly. Okay, so in the presentation by Nate, the call to peace is evident in the midst of war, in the midst of darkness, in the midst of persecution. The churches in Kurdish have embraced peace not only as a command, but a way of life. Through divine intuition, they see clearly that war creates more war and violence more violence. We must therefore look to the churches in Kurdish for insight into the way of peace. And I quote, the Orthodox and Chaldean churches in this area decided that in order for Christianity to continue to thrive and for overall peace to reign, they needed to focus on community development and peacemaking. This peacemaking view has become the heartbeat of their theology. They not only see it as a requirement of the church, but they see it as a form of outreach that is scripturally mandated. As we know, Quakers assert a doctrine of peace. Their protest is against the systems and institutions responsible for creating war, though even more so is their unflinching rally against the sinful desires liable for the pain and suffering, namely avarice. Through the power of grace, the church in Iraq far surpasses the American church in their understanding of what it means to be a peace church. So where and when did the tolerance and endorsement of violence enter into the American church? Did it begin in the history with the Holy Wars in 1096, with the Christian use of force and violence to convert heathens? Is it rooted in hatred of those who are different or those who we perceive as persecuting us? Could it be found in ignorance or misinterpretation of Scripture? Perhaps it is rooted in pride and unwillingness to admit fault or participation in the atrocities caused by war. The questions go on, but I hope that we can all agree that Jesus taught a gospel and a way of life that was peace-filled. This way of life is found in Scripture, but is lived out through the Spirit. So where can we find an example of a church that is living out their peace? Nate directed our attention to the Eastern Church. For Eastern Christianity, social justice and peacemaking are not topics to be debated, but rather to be accepted without hesitation. Lost my spot. For them, it is a matter of survival and of being consistent with Christ that is present in Scriptures. This is the way of peace being lived out through a dedicated life to Christ. We need the examples of the saints and their communities to shine a light on the path before us. So what role does the American church have to play in Kurdish? We start with holding our nation accountable. Nate talked about the disastrous effect that outside media and military influence has had in the country. Too often, the media only reports the things that the majority wants to hear. So long as the good guys are winning and the bad guys are losing, most people don't care. This one-sided portal of reality creates a distorted view and is not truthful. Outside military influence has destroyed bridges created by the indigenous people. I quote, "History has proved time and time again that American military interference in the Middle East has led to the oppression of those communities." So what can I do? This thought might be going through your head as you have begun to listen. I believe it is important to realize that change begins by becoming informed, which is what's happening here tonight. As you receive more information and become aware, you begin to understand. And when you understand, you are able to empathize. And empathy is fertile ground for the Holy Spirit to work through you. As Nate stated, the American church has a rare opportunity on its hands. Friends theology, with its history of peacemaking and social justice, endorses the idea of direct nonviolent action. What better place to practice these peace testimonies than in the very areas that the American government has damaged? And so that's a expanded view. And so I'm a chaplain at Topeka Correctional Facility. And so we have all sorts of people from the community of Kansas. It's from everyone from all parts of Kansas. And what happens there because peace is a huge deal. So in a practicality for them, it's learning peacemaking skills. a lot of them are there because they don't have any peace skills. Violence is what led them to be where they are. And so there's classes there that teach, number one, forgiveness. So forgiveness is a huge place to start because a lot of the reason why violence and continues to go on in the communities is because there's someone's hurt, retaliation. So and I'm willing to bet here today that every single person in this room is a pacifist. You might doubt me, but I think everybody is, because when you were, let's say, when you were kids, or if you have children, did your parents teach you to try to not fight people? Maybe they didn't, but the reason why is because that's all the response these inmates have. They never had anybody teach them any kind of peaceful conflict resolution. It was, they saw it from their parents that you solve conflicts by violence. That's how inevitably it ends up. But every single person here, I bet, at some point in time, chose to try to work something out with someone. They didn't resort straight to violence. Otherwise, you would probably be in prison right now. So, so you are a pacifist at the very core of who you are. Every single time you choose to try to talk something through, every time you choose to not react violently to someone, then you're being a pacifist. You're choosing peace instead of war. And so, what's the difference between that and at a grand scale? I don't know the difference. It's a choice. War is a choice, and it begins by yourself. So let's see. Did I have anything else? And just to bring it even a little closer to home, you guys, this isn't far away. This is here. I bet every single person. I was a student here at Barclay, and I remember there was people who annoyed me here. And I bet you got someone in your dorm right now. You can probably pop in your head, man, that person makes me really upset, or really frustrates you, or gets on your nerves. But here's your practice. That how do you respond to that person today? How do you respond? Are you going to respond peacefully, or are you going to respond with violence? And I hope you guys can all choose peace. So that's all.
Thank you. All right. We're going to open it up for questions. I doubt any of you have any. This was a very non-controversial topic. Everybody's pretty well in agreement on it. Any questions for this?
This is for Jesse. While you are ministering in the prison system, are there cycles that you see maybe that a lot of people that have chosen violence like share in common, like a brokenness maybe?
Yeah, it's a never-ending circle. Violence creates more violence, and then eventually someone gets killed, and then someone kills the other person, and so on and so forth. And it just that's how it works. Me and Nate are mad at each other. And we're arguing, and then I call him a bad word. He gets mad at me, and let's say he hits me. Then I hit him back where I don't. And then I go back, and I talk to my homies, and we're going to jump him. And then he gets jumped, and his crew jumps. And that's how it goes. And so it starts with that simple moment.
You both sort of said that you were in agreement that social justice is something that's controversial here, but shouldn't be. Would you give like a definition of what social justice is and maybe why it's not controversial, even though to many people it is?
I would describe social justice as direct action and recognition of people that are oppressed and struggling with poverty. That's the way I would say it.
So I'm trying to understand your question. Are you talking about here, why it's controversial here?
That's half the question. Why would it be controversial here versus there? But also just sort of a basic definition of what you mean by that, because I think it's sort of a vaguely defined term in our culture.
It's a very encompassing term, social justice. Well, I'll answer the first part, why it could be. I mean, I don't think it should be controversial. I think every single person, I don't know, my assumption is that at some level, every single person is into social justice. Maybe not the same. So if it's controversial, I think it's a lack of understanding. Like I was stating, the way that you overcome conflict is by understanding the other person. And once you understand them, or you spend time to get to know them and understand them, then you can find empathy. You begin to understand that you have empathy, and they're no longer your enemy. They become your friend. Social justice for me is doing something. It's an action.
Thank you. Okay, let me find that. I wrote it down. Well, you talked about. Is it on? Yeah. I think so. Okay. You talked about the negative effects that the media had from portraying the violence and going, "This is what needs to be done with the military." What's a rough estimate of how you think it would at least begin if it started portraying peace? Like, what would happen if we actually built up those communities instead of tore them down?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience in Iraqi Kurdistan. Okay, I know I shouldn't probably mention the show, but there's an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David is trying to find a house to use a restroom in. And he can't find the right house. And he opens the door to this woman in a burqa. She only has the eyes showing. He takes one look at her and he says, "Nah." And as he's walking away, this woman says, "No, what do you want?" And he's like, "Really?" So basically what I'm trying to say is, when I was over there, it was a bunch of those reactions constantly. I didn't realize my own perceived notions of, stuff when it came to that region. So I think what would happen if the media actually portrayed, these Christians getting along with the Muslims, with the Yazidis, with the Zastafarians. I just mispronounced that, but not that any of you would call me out. But, it's just kind of interesting. I think the media often likes to feed off tragedy and controversy. And hearing stories about radical peace like this is amazing. I can give you news sources to look up that document this stuff, but it is happening. I've seen it firsthand, and it's continuing to happen. And it's a really optimistic trend. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Just to be clear, the microphone isn't necessarily for us. It's more for kind of people online that are watching, if you're wondering why it's not actually picking up and amplifying.
So I was wondering more about your comments about Israel, basically, in that conflict. So are they, is Kurdistan's conflict and Israel's conflict connected, other than you were saying that America got involved in the Iraqi war in Israel, basically, through war? That was the way that we decided was aid for them. Was that the only connection, or is there more going on there in connection with?
Well, I mainly used that as an example, but something that's surprising is that Kurdistan is an ally of Israel, and Israel wholeheartedly supported Kurdistan's independence, which is also fascinating. The Kurds were the original allies of the Americans during the Iraq War. I'm not sure if this is an exact estimate, but no American was killed in the Kurdish region of Iraq during the invasion. And without the Kurds allowing them access, they would not have been able to reach the lower part. So the Kurds and Israel would actually be allies if they got their independence. But I was using Israel and Palestine as an example because often, both sides portray this very different picture, but it's actually a lot more complex than we realize. So, did I answer your question? All right.
As someone that lived most of my life through the Cold War and has been very interested in missions, how is it that the Presbyterians were able to get into Iraqi Kurdistan to establish churches? And how would the Friends penetrate the Iraqi government to send missionaries, or is that something that would have to be more undercover?
The Presbyterians have always had the historic presence in the Middle East. The reason they're still there is because the communities there tend to be drawn to a higher liturgical movement. I can't explain the Seventh-day Adventist, but things I accidentally say. So I think missions, if we are going to send missionaries over there, they're going to have to go primarily as peacemakers first, because Kurds especially will not listen to what you have to say unless you're friends with them and unless you establish that firm connection. As you know, I talked about God and Jesus with several Muslims in Iraqi Kurdistan, and people said, wow, it's a miracle your head's still on, you know, and it's a lot less complicated than we make it out to be. So. Uh-oh. Kevin has something.
I was going to ask something, but I'll give it to you.
Okay. Great presentation. Did I understand you correctly that the Muslim imams joined with the Orthodox Church in their in their Christmas service in support of them? And so that's one thing. And how do you make sense of that? You as a Christian now, a pastor, what triggered in you to become part of this work that seems so outside of our reality?
Well, let me just display it like this. Are there any former pastors or pastors in the room? Okay. Has a Muslim cleric ever walked into your church? Exactly. No, it cracks me up when people criticize social justice and peacemaking because they see it as movements instead of evangelism. But in my experience, it always ends in evangelism because you're establishing you care about these people enough to listen to what they have to say. So as a pastor, if a Muslim cleric decided to walk into my church, or if a Jewish rabbi, or I don't know, a Methodist walked into my church, I'd take them.
Jesse, you've been a little quiet over there. I got a question. One of the things I heard you saying in your response was there's some nuance to this. I think one of the reasons it was asked why this is so controversial, and I think one of the reasons it's controversial is because people think it's an either or. Either I have to be a complete pacifist or I'm a warmonger. And so you brought up this idea of choice, but I think one of the things I've noticed is I don't always instinctively make that choice. So would you say there are some practices that would help prepare the heart to be able to even see another side?
Sure, definitely. I mean, when you become a Christian, you begin to change and you begin to become more peace-like, I think. So I'm trying to think of some practical ways. So I keep getting drawn back to one of the things that happens at our facility is a class called Growing Through Loss, which is really focused a lot on grief and how to grow through that. And grief never stops, but it becomes a part of your story and kind of moving like that. And so I think that when you begin to, I don't know when, I guess reflection, maybe it's counterintuitive to not, I guess, act violently, which is kind of, there's a lot of instinctual things as Christians that we do not do. And so I guess how I see it is, I don't know, how I see peace, it begins with forgiveness. It begins with humility. I don't know if those are things you cultivate through practice. I guess you have to focus on, and to get started, you have to admit your fault, which, is a humbling experience, and you have to work on forgiveness. And so maybe, I don't know if that's a practical thing, but go for it.
Okay, we got a question from one of our viewers online. I would prefer peace over war, but what would you say when dealing with a group like ISIS or other extremist groups who use extreme violence?
That is obviously a very hard and complex topic. And as we know, the Christians who were kidnapped by ISIS, they ended up getting martyred. But one of the things I'm primarily focused on is peacemaking in such a way where that event is not necessary. And it's, again, recognizing through these churches that ISIS will never fully go away until that ideology is challenged. Now, as far as self-defense goes, my personal theology says there's a gray area there that can ultimately be judged by God. But ultimately, peacemaking seeks to put yourself never in that situation and seeks to combat that type of hateful attitude.
Nate, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that that people in the Middle East view America and the West in general as Christian nations, which I thought a little bit strange. The West in general, because it's been, especially in Europe, increasingly post-Christian, and America is not quite there, but it's sort of catching up. It's a very materialist culture with, I suppose, some Christian trimmings still on it as a culture. So why do you suppose that they see us as a quote-unquote Christian nation, despite all of that? And as a second question, so when you said that Friends ought to have a presence in the Middle East, especially in Iraq and the other areas you were mentioning, would it be as simple as going to the yearly meeting and saying, hey, we need to plant a church in this area of the Middle East? And would that immediately work?
All right. Your first question is sociological. No, that means has to do with society. My bad. I spend most of my time in books. You'll have to forgive me. So this was also observed in Kenya. In Kenya, there is a high epidemic of AIDS. Like the median age of death is like 19. And that is because they observe American culture, and they also have this assumption that American culture is Christian in its essence. So when they see like rap videos glorifying sex, when they see, stuff like glorifying drugs and violence, they think, oh, I'm a Christian, so I'm allowed to do that. Like that's an unfortunate part. And in the Middle East, it's kind of like the same way. And it's because they don't have the access to the information we have access to. And also because they have memories of Americans walking down the streets, and they have memories of Bush declaring on TV that God was blessing their mission. So when a foreign leader openly declares God and his Christian faith and declaring war on you personally, what are you going to think? And your second question, I think it can be, obviously it's not as simple as going to a yearly meeting and saying, hey, I want to go to Iraq. But I think if we are going to establish a presence there, we need to first work with the Christian communities already there and establish a bond there saying, we're not here to take your traditions from you. Now, there is one evangelical church with 400 members in Iraqi Kurdistan, and I know of one evangelical missionary who did not care to reply back to me. But other than that, we have Christian peacemaker teams. We have the Alternative to Violence program there so far. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you, Nate. Thank you, Jesse. I want to read as sort of a benediction to our time tonight, a prayer by St. Teresa of Avila. She's great if you haven't read her. Christ has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes, yours are his body. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Amen. Have a good night.